"Try not to embarrass us tonight," my aunt whispered as I parked the car. I nodded, got back in, and took the cake, the gifts, and their reserved venue key with me. 3 hours later, I got a text from my nephew. "Everyone's just standing around." What happened? I, 32 had always been the family disappointment. Tonight was supposed to be different. My nephew's graduation party was the social event of the season for our extended family. Everyone would be there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole clan that had spent the last 15 years reminding me of every mistake I'd ever made. But this time, I'd volunteered to help. I'd ordered the cake, bought thoughtful gifts, and even secured the venue reservation at the fancy country club downtown. For once, I was going to be the helpful one, the reliable one. That illusion shattered the moment I pulled into my aunt's driveway. She emerged from her house looking immaculate as always, her hair perfectly styled and her dress expensive enough to feed a small village. She slid into my passenger seat with the practiced grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Then she leaned close and whispered those words that would change everything. She told me to try not to embarrass them tonight. Her voice carried that familiar mixture of condescension and genuine concern that had followed me through every family gathering since I was 12. She reminded me that this was an important night for my nephew, that all the right people would be there, and that she hoped I understood the significance of the occasion. I nodded, smiled, told her I understood completely. She seemed satisfied with my response and settled back into her seat, already checking her phone for messages from other family members. She mentioned that my uncle was running late from his business meeting, that my cousin had picked up the flowers, and that everything was falling perfectly into place. Except it wasn't. As she continued talking about the guest list and the seating arrangements, something inside me snapped. 15 years of being the family screw-up crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. I realized I was tired of being their backup plan, their last resort, their reliable disappointment. I pulled out of the driveway and drove exactly 1 block before making a decision that would echo through our family for years to come. I turned around. My aunt noticed immediately when I pulled back into her driveway. She asked what was wrong, her voice sharp with the kind of panic that comes from having your carefully laid plans disrupted. I told her I'd forgotten something important and would be right back. She started to protest, reminding me that we were already cutting it close on time, but I was already out of the car and walking toward my trunk. Inside were 3 things that represented months of planning and preparation. A custom-ordered graduation cake that had cost me 2 days' salary, a collection of gifts I'd spent weeks selecting, and most importantly, the venue reservation confirmation that was in my name because I'd volunteered to handle the booking. I gathered everything up, my aunt's increasingly frantic questions following me from the car. She wanted to know what I was doing, why I was taking the items, where I thought I was going. I told her there had been a change of plans. The look on her face was worth every penny I'd spent on that cake. I explained that I'd reconsidered my role in the evening's festivities. After careful reflection, I decided that someone as prone to embarrassment as myself shouldn't be responsible for such important items. I was simply removing the temptation to disappoint everyone. She stepped out of the car then, her composure finally cracking. She demanded I put everything back, reminded me of my nephew's feelings, accused me of being childish and petty. But her words felt different now. They had no power over me. I loaded everything into my own car and told her she was welcome to find another way to the party. I mentioned that she might want to call ahead and let them know there would be some changes to the evening's arrangements. The drive home was the most liberating 20 minutes of my adult life. I parked in my garage and carried everything inside. The cake went into my refrigerator, the gifts onto my kitchen table, and the venue reservation into my paper shredder. Then I ordered pizza, cracked open a beer, and settled in to watch a movie. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed. My nephew had texted asking what happened. He mentioned that everyone was standing around confused, that the venue staff was claiming they had no reservation, and that someone had apparently taken the cake and gifts. He seemed more bewildered than angry, which somehow made it worse. I stared at that text for a long time before responding. I told him I was sorry he was caught in the middle of this, but that sometimes adults make decisions that affect everyone around them. I suggested he ask his mother about the conversation we'd had in the car. Then I turned off my phone. Update 1. The fallout began the next morning. My phone had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages when I finally turned it back on. The family group chat was in absolute chaos. My aunt had apparently spent the rest of the previous evening trying to salvage the party. She'd managed to find a backup venue at a chain restaurant, but it was cramped and noisy and nothing like the elegant affair she'd planned. Someone had driven to 3 different stores trying to find a graduation cake, eventually settling for a sheet cake from a grocery store that was decorated with generic congratulations. The gifts were a bigger problem. Several family members had contributed money toward expensive presents that were now sitting in my living room. My uncle had apparently offered to cover the cost of replacing everything, but the damage to the family's reputation was already done. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. My aunt had told them I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I'd inexplicably decided to sabotage my own nephew's party. Other family members were taking sides, with some defending my past reliability and others pointing to this incident as proof of what they'd always suspected about my character. My nephew texted me privately. He said he was confused and hurt, that he'd thought we had a good relationship, and that he didn't understand why I'd done this to him. His message was worse than all the angry calls from other family members combined because it was genuine. I found myself typing and deleting responses for an hour. How could I explain that this had never been about him? That I'd spent 15 years being treated like a second-class family member and had finally reached my breaking point? That his mother's casual cruelty had been the final straw in a lifetime of accumulated slights? Instead, I told him I was sorry he'd been hurt, that he deserved better than to be caught in the middle of adult drama, and that I hoped he'd understand someday. I offered to give him the gifts I'd bought, explaining that they were chosen specifically for him and had nothing to do with the larger conflict. He didn't respond. Update 2. By the end of the week, the story had spread through our entire extended family network. I was receiving calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to understand what had driven me to such extreme behavior. My cousin called to tell me that my aunt was devastated, that she'd been crying for days and couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. This cousin reminded me that my aunt had always been supportive of me, that she'd helped me through difficult times, and that my reaction had been completely disproportionate to whatever slight I'd perceived. I found myself explaining the whispered comment in the car, the casual assumption that I would embarrass the family, the lifetime of being treated as the problematic relative who needed to be managed rather than included. My cousin listened quietly before suggesting that perhaps my aunt had simply been nervous and hadn't meant anything hurtful by her words. But that was exactly the point. She hadn't meant to be hurtful because she'd never considered that her words might hurt me. I was so far beneath her consideration that casual cruelty came naturally. My mother called next. She was disappointed but not surprised, she said, explaining that she'd always worried something like this would happen. She reminded me that family relationships required compromise and tolerance, that everyone had to overlook small slights for the greater good of family unity. I asked her if she'd ever been told not to embarrass the family at a gathering. She admitted she hadn't, but insisted that was different somehow. When I pressed her to explain how it was different, she changed the subject. My father took a more direct approach. He called to tell me I was being selfish and immature, that I'd hurt innocent people to make a point about my own feelings. He demanded I apologize to everyone involved and try to make amends for the damage I'd caused. I told him I'd consider it. Update 3. 2 weeks after the incident, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to attend my cousin's wedding, which was scheduled for the following month. I hadn't been planning to go. The invitation had arrived months earlier, back when I was still trying to be the helpful family member, but after the graduation party incident, I'd assumed I was no longer welcome. However, I realized that avoiding family gatherings indefinitely wasn't a sustainable solution. My cousin called when she heard I was planning to attend. She was nervous, she admitted, worried about potential drama at her wedding. She asked if I was planning to cause another scene, to disrupt her special day the way I'd disrupted my nephew's party. I assured her that I had no intention of causing problems at her wedding. I explained that my actions at the graduation party had been a specific response to a specific situation, not a general declaration of war against family gatherings. She seemed relieved, but still cautious. She mentioned that my aunt would be there, that tensions might be high, and that she hoped everyone could put aside their differences for one evening. I told her I understood and that I would be on my best behavior. The wedding reception was held at the same country club where my nephew's party was supposed to have taken place. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through the elegant ballroom, noting the crystal chandeliers and pristine white tablecloth that my nephew had missed out on experiencing. My aunt was already there when I arrived, surrounded by other family members and looking radiant in her mother-of-the-bride dress. She noticed me immediately but didn't approach. Instead, she seemed to stiffen slightly and turned her attention back to her conversation. I found my assigned seat at a table with younger cousins and their partners, people who were friendly but not closely involved in the recent drama. The conversation was light and pleasant, focusing on the beauty of the ceremony and the happiness of the bride and groom. Halfway through dinner, my nephew approached my table. He'd grown taller since I'd last seen him, and his graduation suit had been replaced by a sharp tuxedo that made him look older than his 18 years. He asked if we could talk privately. We stepped out onto the venue's terrace, where the evening air was cool and the sounds of the reception were muffled by closed doors. He told me he'd been thinking about what had happened, that he'd talked to his friends and his girlfriend about the situation, and that he was starting to understand my perspective. He mentioned that he'd always noticed how differently I was treated at family gatherings, how I was often assigned the practical tasks while others got to enjoy themselves, how conversations would shift when I joined them. He'd attributed it to personality differences, but recent events had made him reconsider. I was surprised by his insight. I told him I was sorry he'd been caught in the middle of the situation, that I'd never intended for him to suffer the consequences of my actions. I explained that I'd reached a breaking point and had reacted impulsively, but that I didn't regret standing up for myself. He nodded thoughtfully and said he respected my decision, even if he wished it had been handled differently. Then he asked about the gifts I'd bought him. I'd brought them with me, actually. They were in my car, wrapped and waiting. I retrieved them and watched as he opened each one, his face lighting up with genuine appreciation. The expensive watch, the leather portfolio for college, the rare book about his favorite historical period, all chosen specifically for him, with thought and care. He thanked me sincerely and said these were better than anything he'd received at the improvised party. Then he asked if I'd consider giving his mother another chance, explaining that she'd been genuinely distressed by the incident and had spent considerable time reflecting on her behavior. I told him I'd think about it. Update 4. The confrontation I'd been avoiding finally happened during the reception's dessert course. My aunt approached my table while I was finishing my wedding cake, her expression carefully neutral but her posture tense. She asked if we could speak privately. I followed her to a quiet corner of the ballroom, where she immediately began what sounded like a prepared speech. She said she'd been thinking about our last conversation, that she'd replayed it countless times trying to understand where things had gone wrong. She admitted that her comment about not embarrassing the family had been thoughtless and hurtful. She explained that she'd been nervous about the party, worried about everything going perfectly, and had spoken without considering how her words might affect me. She insisted she'd never meant to imply that I was inherently embarrassing or that my presence was a burden. I listened quietly as she continued, explaining that she'd always seen me as reliable and helpful, that she'd counted on my support precisely because she trusted me. She said she'd been shocked by my reaction because she'd never realized I felt marginalized by the family. When she finished, I told her I appreciated her acknowledgement of the hurt her words had caused. But I also explained that the problem went deeper than one thoughtless comment. I described years of feeling like an outsider at family gatherings, of being assigned grunt work while others socialized, of having my contributions taken for granted while my mistakes were highlighted. She seemed genuinely surprised by this perspective. She insisted that she'd never intended to make me feel excluded, that she'd simply been trying to include me in family activities by giving me responsibilities. She said she'd always valued my practical nature and had relied on me because she trusted me more than others. I told her that good intentions didn't erase the impact of her actions, that being valued only for my usefulness while being warned not to embarrass the family felt like being treated as a second-class member. She was quiet for a long moment, then asked what it would take for us to repair our relationship. She said she missed having my help and support, that family gatherings felt incomplete without me, and that she was willing to make changes to ensure I felt more included. I told her I needed time to think about it, that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly. I mentioned that I'd been happier in the past 2 weeks than I'd been in years, that standing up for myself had been liberating even if it had caused chaos. She nodded, looking sadder than I'd ever seen her. She said she understood and that she hoped we could find a way forward together. Final update. 3 months have passed since the graduation party incident, and I'm still processing the aftermath. The family dynamics have shifted in ways I never expected. My nephew started college in the fall and has kept in touch regularly. He's majoring in psychology and has developed a keen interest in family systems theory, which he attributes partly to witnessing our conflict. He's become something of a bridge between me and the rest of the family, sharing updates about my life with them and encouraging ongoing communication. My aunt has made genuine efforts to change her behavior. She started inviting me to family gatherings as a guest rather than a helper, and she's been more mindful of how she speaks to me. The change feels artificial sometimes, like she's walking on eggshells, but I appreciate the effort. Other family members have begun treating me differently too. Some seem to respect my willingness to stand up for myself, while others remain wary of my potential for disruption. A few have privately shared their own stories of feeling marginalized or taken for granted within the family structure. I've attended 2 family gatherings since the wedding, and both went smoothly. I brought flowers instead of organizing logistics, participated in conversations rather than serving others, and left when I felt like leaving rather than staying to clean up. It's a small revolution, but it's mine. The most unexpected consequence has been the improvement in my relationship with my parents. They've started treating me as an adult with valid feelings rather than a perpetual problem child. My father actually apologized for dismissing my concerns, and my mother has begun including me in family decisions rather than just expecting compliance. I still have the graduation cake in my freezer. It's become a symbol of sorts, a reminder that I'm worth more than my utility to others, that my feelings matter, that sometimes standing up for yourself requires dramatic action. My nephew asks about it every time we talk. He suggested we have a private celebration, just the two of us, where we can finally eat the cake and celebrate his graduation properly. I think I'd like that. Would I handle the situation differently if I could do it over? Probably. I might have tried talking to my aunt about my feelings before reaching the nuclear option, but I'm not sure talking would have been as effective as action in changing decades of established patterns. Sometimes people need to lose something before they realize its value. Sometimes you have to be willing to burn bridges to build better ones. And sometimes the family disappointment turns out to be the one person willing to tell the truth about how dysfunctional everyone else has become. I'm not the same person who nodded silently in that car 3 months ago. I'm not sure if that's growth or just stubbornness, but it feels like progress.